The arrival of German women POWs in Texas marked an unexpected chapter in the history of World War II. At the end of the war, as Nazi Germany collapsed, the Allied forces began capturing large numbers of soldiers, both male and female, who had fought for the Axis. Among the captives were German women who had served in various capacities, some as auxiliaries, others as medical staff or clerks. Unlike the commonly known stories of male soldiers in combat, the experiences of these women, especially those captured and sent to distant lands like Texas, remain largely untold. Their arrival in the United States presented a unique cultural clash with contrasting military expectations and rural American life serving as a backdrop for their interactions. Many of these women, like their male counterparts, had endured the harrowing conditions of war and its aftermath. They had been caught in the midst of a losing struggle, captured by the very forces they had once been trained to fight against. Transported to the United States, far from home and family, the German women were interned in prison camps designed to hold prisoners of war. However, their experience in these camps would be unlike that of most male prisoners. The United States had a policy for handling female POWs that was distinct from the treatment of men. While male POWs were often subjected to forced labor or confinement, the treatment of women was, in many cases, more lenient. This leniency, however, was not without its own set of challenges and difficulties. The arrival of the German women in Texas was part of this larger framework of managing war captives, but their experience was shaped by the unique environment of the Texas camps and the culture of the American soldiers and cowboys who were tasked with their care. When the women first arrived, they were housed in a camp outside of the larger urban areas of Texas. The camp was situated in the heart of a region that was known for its vast open spaces and ranching culture. The soldiers who were assigned to guard and manage the prisoners were mostly young men from rural backgrounds, many of them familiar with horses and the cowboy lifestyle. They had grown up in small towns and spent their days riding horses, working cattle, and living a life that was starkly different from the experiences of the women they now guarded. For these German POWs, the prospect of being held in a remote and unfamiliar location so far from home was daunting. They had been used to the rigid and disciplined environment of the German military, where order and control were paramount. Now, they found themselves in a land that seemed to operate under entirely different rules. What they hadn't anticipated was the treatment they would receive at the hands of these cowboys, men who, despite their wartime duties, seemed to embody a different kind of freedom and spirit. One of the most surprising aspects of their internment was the way in which the American soldiers interacted with them. Unlike the harsh, authoritative demeanor they had come to expect from their captors, these soldiers often treated the women with surprising gentleness. Instead of being kept under heavy guard or confined to small, suffocating spaces, the German women were allowed more freedom than they could have imagined. In fact, many of them were taken out to the ranches where the soldiers worked and introduced to the horses that were central to the region's culture. The German women POWs were shocked by this gesture. They had expected punishment, perhaps even cruelty, after their capture. The idea of being placed on horseback was completely alien to them, and they viewed it with a mix of fear and confusion. The women had not been trained to ride horses, and many had no prior experience with the animals. Yet the American soldiers encouraged them to try, teaching them the basics of riding and allowing them to experience something completely outside the realm of their prior training. For the prisoners, the act of being placed on a horse was more than just a physical experience. It was a cultural shock. Horses were not simply animals to these women. They represented a symbol of freedom and power. In Nazi Germany, horses had been associated with military power, often used for cavalry units or for ceremonial purposes. But in Texas, they were tied to a different kind of power, the independence and rugged individualism that defined the cowboy lifestyle. Riding a horse in the American Southwest was not only a practical skill, but also a reflection of a broader cultural identity. Cowboys, who were known for their strong sense of independence and their connection to the land, viewed the horse as an integral part of life. The women, who had grown up in a society where women's roles were often dictated by the rigid demands of a militarized culture, found themselves in a situation that was hard to understand. Being placed on a horse instead of being shackled with chains was an expression of trust and freedom that they had never expected from their captors. As they rode through the ranches, the women began to experience a world of freedom they had never known. The sight of the expansive Texas landscape stretched out before them, a vast horizon where there were no walls or fences to confine them, was something they had not imagined possible. The open land mirrored the freedom they were starting to feel in their new environment. The act of riding, once a source of fear, began to symbolize the kind of release that only such an unexpected environment could provide. For the soldiers, the decision to put the women on horseback was not a political statement or an act of mercy. It was simply part of their daily routine. But for the German women, it became a profound experience. The soldiers, many of whom had never seen war from the perspective of a prisoner, found themselves interacting with people they had once viewed as enemies, but who were now, in a sense, fellow human beings. The experience of sharing these moments of unexpected freedom with the women changed the way the soldiers viewed the war and its aftermath. The psychological impact on the women was significant. Many had been hardened by years of war, but the sight of the cowboys, their ease around the horses, their simple yet profound connection to the land, began to break down some of their preconceived notions. They began to see a world outside the scope of the war, one where there was more to life than fighting and survival. The horses, in a way, became symbols of this new world, offering the women a glimpse of something beyond the trauma of war. This chapter in history, though largely forgotten, serves as a reminder of the unexpected moments of humanity that emerged from the chaos of World War II. The treatment of these German women POWs in Texas, so vastly different from the brutal conditions many faced in Europe, was a story of transformation, not just for the prisoners, but for the soldiers who, in the midst of war, found a way to offer something as simple as a ride on horseback. The treatment of the German women POWs by the American soldiers also revealed the vast differences in cultural norms and expectations between the two sides. The soldiers, many of whom had been raised in the vast open spaces of Texas, where individualism, self-reliance, and the cowboy way of life were revered, viewed their interactions with the prisoners through a completely different lens. The idea of horseback riding, a quintessentially Texan activity, was far from the harsh, regimented military training the women had undergone under Nazi rule. In the camps, many of the American soldiers were young, some no older than the women themselves, and had little to no previous experience in combat. Yet they were thrust into the role of captors, tasked with holding prisoners of war far from home. For these soldiers, the act of putting the women on horses was not born out of a desire to humiliate or subjugate them, but to offer them a form of freedom and a connection to the landscape that was so deeply tied to their own identities. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that, in the vast, open spaces of Texas, there was a life outside the confines of the war, a life that didn't rely on the destruction and cruelty that had marked so much of the prisoners' experiences. It was a moment of contrast to the rigid discipline of the German military, which had been built on conformity and control, and a glimpse of an alternative worldview, one where people, even those who had been enemies, could experience something as simple as a horse ride, a symbol of liberty in the midst of a chaotic world. The prisoners' reactions were mixed, but there was a sense of bewilderment as well as a dawning realization. The concept of being treated in such a way was almost inconceivable to them. In the concentration camps or on the battlefront, such treatment was unimaginable. Women in the German military were often given roles that confined them to clerical work or medical duties, roles that were far removed from the fighting. They were not warriors, but rather auxiliaries, often seen as expendable. In contrast, here, in Texas, the cowboys saw them as human beings first, not as enemies or tools of war. The shock they felt upon being placed on horseback was not just about the novelty of riding. It was the unexpected nature of the encounter, an act of basic human kindness from those who had, only months before, been considered adversaries. For the women, the process of learning to ride and becoming accustomed to the horses was not without its challenges. Many of the women had no prior experience with horses, and the sight of the powerful animals was intimidating. The horses were not just a means of transportation, but a connection to a culture that seemed worlds apart from the rigid, highly structured environment they had come from. In the German military, women were rarely given the chance to ride horses. Their roles were far more constrained, limited to non-combat duties. The physicality of riding, of being on top of a horse with a sense of freedom and control, was a stark contrast to their experience of being prisoners of war, confined to camps and subjected to the unpredictable and harsh nature of wartime internment. As the German women learned to ride, some began to bond with the animals, forming a connection that went beyond the simple task of sitting on horseback. Horses, in many ways, became a form of therapy. The movement of the horse, the rhythmic gallop, and the bond that developed between rider and animal offered a sense of calm, an emotional release that many of the women had not experienced for years. The horses, for some, became a vehicle for emotional healing, offering an outlet for the trauma they had endured during the war. Being placed in a position of power, even in such a small way as being atop a horse, was transformative. For these women, who had been caught in the devastation of war and the horrors of the Nazi regime, riding horses offered a new sense of self. It gave them a taste of freedom they had not known before, freedom from the strictures of war, from their roles as prisoners, and from the burdens that had been placed on them by both their society and the military. In contrast, for the soldiers who guided them, it was an opportunity to showcase a way of life they had long cherished, but had been shaped by war. The soldiers' connection to the horses wasn't just practical. It was deeply emotional. The act of caring for and working with horses was central to their identity as cowboys, and it served as a reminder of a life that was separate from the violence and chaos of the war. These young men were no longer riding horses for sport or for work. They were doing so to share a part of their world with the women who had once been their enemies. It wasn't an attempt to dominate or subjugate. It was a form of shared experience, a fleeting moment of humanity that transcended the war that had brought them together. The cultural differences between the German women and their American captors were profound. The women had been raised in a society that placed a premium on duty, discipline, and obedience to authority. They had been trained to be part of a highly organized military force where individual freedom was limited, especially for women. In contrast, the American soldiers came from a world where individualism, freedom, and the cowboy ethos defined their way of life. They had grown up in an environment where the open plains of Texas were a symbol of personal freedom, where working with animals and living in harmony with nature was part of daily life. The unexpected interactions between the German women and the American soldiers, particularly those involving horseback riding, highlighted these stark cultural contrasts. The women, raised in a system that prized conformity and order, were thrust into an environment that emphasized individual freedom, openness, and a deep connection to the land. The act of learning to ride horses symbolized more than just a physical skill. It represented a deeper emotional and psychological shift. For the women, the experience offered a brief escape from the trauma and hardship of war and captivity. It provided them with a rare opportunity to experience something resembling freedom in a way they had never imagined. This moment in history, while small in the broader scope of World War II, provides a poignant reminder of the unexpected acts of humanity that can emerge even in the most brutal of circumstances. The interaction between the German women POWs and the American soldiers in Texas, though brief, was a moment of shared experience that transcended nationalities and ideologies. It was an encounter that allowed both groups to see one another not just as enemies, but as individuals with hopes, fears, and the capacity for connection. It remains a testament to the strange, often contradictory ways in which the war shaped the lives of those involved, offering glimpses of humanity in the most unexpected of places.